Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Matters, and so does whatever I have in this mug today, which unfortunately isn't coffee. A History Matters mug. Today, as advertised, we're going to be talking about what does the press cover when it covers? And it's a title born of the fact that I ended up doing a lot of press in the last week, and I ended up being interested in what I was asked or what I wasn't asked. I'm going to go back in history, but that's what led to the topic. But before I go on with the topic, I'm going to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who is back after being away last week, and who will tell us the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. As always, delighted to be with you on a Friday morning for History Matters. I'm Annie Evans. I'm with the New American History Project at University of Richmond. And the rules of the game are pretty simple, kids. We will have an awesome discussion with Joanne. We will listen, we will take notes, we will engage in the chat. And you, my good friends, you will add questions in the Q&A, because that is where I will look for them in about 30 minutes. And then we will entertain your questions. So it's really important that you put them in the Q&A, because the chat goes way too fast for us to keep up with, okay? And we love it when you give us really, really good questions. Okay, we're ready.
Annie loves it particularly because she kind of, here you go.
Yeah, and I love it when we can clear the whole Q&A.
That is true. I can tell your enjoyment of that.
Enjoy that. All right, friends, we'll see you in a little bit.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so as I said at the outset, the reason for this episode is because it was a little bonkers. Because of the speakership struggle, whatever you want to call it, conflict, contest. I used every word you could possibly find to use in a 3-day period. But because of that, because it was the anniversary of January 6th, because there was the speakership battle, and then lo and behold, someone lunged at somebody on the House floor, it was a trifecta of press coverage for me. I've talked a lot about January 6th, if it's Congress, and it has to do with a speakership battle going on forever. Most of them are before the Civil War. People turned to me. And then, of course, as soon as someone appeared to, I'll go back to that in a moment, but what looked like a very physical moment on the floor of the House, the entire world turned to me. So it was crazy. And I was on CNN International, and I think I was on MSNBC 3 times, and I was PBS interview. Anyway, it was crazy. It was crazy. And I would finish one thing, and then I would go check my email, and there'd be a new invitation. So, and I apologize for the construction noise, which started, I think, about 5 a.m. At any rate, so we'll try and do our best without that. But at any rate, given all of that press coverage and the fact that it was very different, what they asked, what I answered, what they wanted to know, that's what sparked this topic today. Partly because what does the press in the present cover when it covers, and in the past, how has that been similar or different? And that's the road I want to travel today. But as far as what happened now with the recent speakership kerfuffle, it's such a good word, and I've never said it out loud, whatever that is, ado, the speakership ado. More than anything else, the question everybody wants to know is, has it happened before? Now, maybe there was a moment early on when we got past, 8, 9 ballots for the speakership that people didn't know that it had happened before, but after a while, everyone knew it had happened before, right? And maybe people didn't quite know 1923, but the entire world wanted to hear about 1856. That was it, 1856. Tell me about 1856. Like, that's a big one, right? Yeah, it is. There's some others too. So that one thing was people just wanted, I wasn't necessarily asked, what does it mean that it's happening now? Come back to that later. I was asked, has it happened before? Tell us about that. So I was, as a historian, I was asked for stories, right? I was asked to be descriptive, and given that most people don't know any of this history, that makes sense. I was also asked a good number of times, what does this say about the future? Now, as a historian, I can sort of toss off some things, but all I can tell you, and we're going to do it here this morning, past patterns, what past patterns are, and what they suggest about the present and perhaps the future. But I can't, I am loath to say, well, I predict the next 2 years. I could, but to me, that's not the most useful question to ask. More interesting would have been more specific questions about, for example, the rules, right? The fact that the rules were coming. What are the importance of the rules in the speaker battle? What's going to happen? In other words, what does it mean that this is happening, and how might it affect, generally speaking, how does the speaker affect the working of the House? There are any number of things that might have been useful. More than anything else, people wanted to talk about the length. They all wanted to talk about 1856. And as far as what we saw in the way of coverage, I don't know about you, and we could talk about this during the question period. What I saw, and I was watching C-SPAN, I just had it on. And whenever I was here in my house, the TV was on and C-SPAN was on because I was fascinated with what we were seeing. I'm going to come back to that in a moment too. But the coverage that I saw, in addition to the wow, it's a spectacle kind of coverage, were people talking about McCarthy and people talking about Getz. And then people just kind of generally, initially laughing at what was happening, and then laughing not so much at what was happening. But as far as I know, I didn't see a lot of discussion of the meaning of it or the implications of it, or maybe not most interesting to me, but particularly interesting to me, what can we tell about the present by looking at the past, right? Which is what we do every Friday here on History Matters. So the op-ed that I wrote for the New York Times was born of that, right? The op-ed that I wrote was, okay, here we go, another big one, like all the ones that happened before the Civil War. And except for 1923, all of them were before the Civil War. All of the lengthy, more than 10-hour speakership, 10-ballot speakership battles were before the Civil War. Why was that? What were they like? And what's different now? Those are logical, good questions to ask. And my op-ed investigated that, right? And it said some things are similar in all of these past battles, that parties were fractured, and when parties are fractured, makes perfect sense. It's harder to land on one person. And also it just changes the dynamics of politics. The other thing that was true of all of those past battles is that they were very, very centered on one particular policy or issue. Well, not all of them, but almost all of them, slavery. More than anything else, what people wanted to know is what the speaker candidates thought about congressional legislation on slavery. The reason why they wanted to know that is because the speaker, although it's not supposed to be a party position, it can profoundly shape what Congress does. It puts people on committees, it calls on people or doesn't call on people, it cooperates with people or doesn't cooperate with people. I mean, the speaker can have a big influence, even while maintaining the appearance of a lack of bias. This has been true, throughout all of American history. So this is not something born of our era. But at any rate, all of these things would have been interesting things for the press to talk about rather than asking me about 1856 a lot of times. It's a really good story, and I like telling stories. But it was what differentiated past battles to this one more than anything else to me was the lack of a single focused issue, which seemed interesting to me because it wasn't that far in the past that the Republican Party ran a candidate without a platform, right? A presidential candidate without a platform. They're not about policies right now. And what we were watching on the floor was largely a power struggle within the party. And, some people said to me after I wrote the op-ed, well, they have ideas. Like, yeah, I'm sure they have ideas. It's not policies. They have a worldview. I'm sure they do. They do. We see it all the time. None of that shows that they were in the House practically thinking about, I want to pass legislation on X. So, Mr. Maybe Speaker, will you help me with that? Or whatever else. We didn't see that. We just saw kind of a weird power struggle and a near moment of violence. Okay, so one moment for C-SPAN, a little ode to C-SPAN, and then I want to go back to the past and talk a little bit about coverage of this sort in the past generally and of Congress and what that suggests about the present. Now, first off, I do my little ode to C-SPAN, and it left me really mourning the departure of C-SPAN, because I don't know how many of you watched that coverage versus anything else. But, and granted, there's someone controlling the cameras. So I suppose you can say that nothing is entirely unbiased. However, the camera was pulled pretty far back, and we saw a lot of what was happening. And we saw the dynamics on the floor. We saw people interacting or not interacting, people sitting alone, people playing on their phones. And then that moment of near violence, that was sort of off to the left-hand side of the screen. And suddenly there was something happening. And I heard, people yelling, and I'm looking to see what's going on. We saw the Congress as a human body that it is. Now, granted, if those cameras were back, typically Congress is someone speechifying and a handful of people scattered about. And it's not like there's always a big discussion going on or that everybody's in the room. So it's not as though if C-SPAN was there, we would get a dramatic display every day. But the difference between that, what we saw with C-SPAN, an actual working Congress, and what we typically get, which is one person speechifying and perhaps it pans back and shows a little bit, it's a really big difference. And in a sense, it's a different Congress that we see, and a different sense of our institutions of government even that we see. Now, I do want to say, in talking about what the press covers when it covers, there really hasn't been a golden age of unbiased, absolutely clear-eyed press coverage in American history. There just hasn't. There are individual outlets, media outlets, that do a better job than others of trying to be unbiased, of trying to see things and say things as they see things. But there are many that don't try, right? And this is the ultimate understatement of the year, but this has always been true. And I've talked before, I believe, about the press in other time periods in early America. They weren't even thinking about objectivity. That wasn't even on the radar screen, and they didn't even have radars or screens in the early republic. They were interested in supporting their party, and newspapers were pretty much party organs, and they were paid for by wealthy people, elite people in the party, and that was their job. Now, the trick of everything, and we're going to see some of it now, we always see some of it, is that however biased people want to be, there has to be the pretense of some degree of objectivity so that people will believe in whatever they're looking at. So in other words, if a newspaper is so crazy over the top to one side, even in early America, people might then be able to dismiss it as well. It's very extreme. But if they seem to be trying to at least glance in the other direction, it becomes harder to dismiss it. And that's the key to unbiased press coverage. It's a little trickier than you might assume, because it's not just we shall always tell the truth. It's creating it, masking it in a certain way. Now, if you go and, one brief thing I want to mention, only because it was an extreme example to me. I have mentioned here many times before, the episode in 1795 where Hamilton is trying to get a crowd to be happy with the Jay Treaty, and people throw rocks at his head, and he storms off with a bunch of Federalists saying, "Men of order, follow me." And he and like a handful of Federalists storm off. It's a great episode, which is why I tell that story so often. But when I was reconstructing it, it took a lot of time. Why? Because if you read about it in a Jeffersonian Republican newspaper, there were masses of people there. It was an amazing demonstration against the Jay Treaty. It was amazing what the public was showing. And if you read a Federalist newspaper, it was like, yeah, there were some people there. It wasn't so big, not a big deal. People aren't really thinking about the Jay Treaty. For me to figure out what actually happened, I had to read a lot of different newspapers and try and piece together, based on them and based on people's private correspondence and based on what I could tell in anything I could find, diaries and whatever else, what actually went on. It took a long time. The same thing is true for Congress, pretty much for a huge chunk of the 19th century, right? There wasn't, and again, here's the sort of, we can be biased, but not super biased. The original Congressional Record was mostly two spin-off newspapers, two spin-offs from newspapers right? So the Globe was a newspaper, the Congressional Globe was a spinoff. So it was partisan newspapers that gave the reporters to keep the Congressional Record. What that meant was that the Congressional Record of one side versus the Congressional Record of the other side is slightly different. Certain people get a lot of coverage, other people don't. Certain topics get a lot of coverage, others don't, depending on which party's newspaper you're looking at. But it couldn't be so extreme that people would dismiss a newspaper, right? That the Congressional Record. It couldn't be so extreme that people would say, oh, bah, humbug, this is that crazy Whig newspaper, a crazy Democratic newspaper. It means nothing. They had to be acting as a record. So this becomes, again, they're covering what they cover. They're being selective about what they're covering. They're trying to do it delicately, somewhat, and yet that's not totally objective and it's not totally unbiased, right? So for any historian who wants to study Congress in the first half of the 19th century, you really have to, or certainly I felt that I had to triangulate to figure out what actually happened, which is kind of interesting, given that there's actually a record, really lengthy one, huge, as a matter of fact. So for me to understand what happened, I needed to look at the record. I needed to look at what the newspapers said about the record. I needed to look in private correspondence of the people there and onlookers to see what they said about what was going on. I had to triangulate endlessly to actually figure out what happened, because they would do this all the time on the floor, knowing that no one would really absolutely know what happened. So there's one moment when someone says, I saw yesterday that so-and-so pulled so-and-so and threw him down in the aisle or whatever. There's some description of a moment of violence, right? So my antennae come up and I start writing it down. And then what do I see? I see someone else stand up in Congress and say, that never happened. We all know that never happened. What kind of a nonsense story is that? And I don't know if it happened. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. It's not in my book because I ultimately couldn't prove whether it did or didn't happen. So there isn't a golden halo of unbiased media ever. Now, that said, it's one thing to say papers are partial. It's another thing partial and trying to sell newspapers and trying to satisfy the public interest. And interestingly, certainly for a big chunk of the 19th century, what people wanted to read about in newspapers was Congress. It wasn't nowadays, and earlier than nowadays, the presidency has become kind of where we look for like the big news. Only recently is Congress now in the, on our radar screen. But generally speaking, it tends to be presidents for a while, at least 20th century that we look at. 19th century Congress was it. And Congress was the majority of column inches in newspapers. Newspapers would have, what do I want to say? Not transcriptions of debates, but versions of debates, long versions of debates, and people would read them and would understand the debate going on in Congress. This is a different era. But again, none of this was unbiased, which means you're seeing what one person wants you to see. Now, here we are, and I'm not going to talk at length about misinformation because everybody talks about misinformation. But here we are in this moment where in some ways you could, if you weren't living in this moment, if you were a historian in the future, you could look back and say, wow, think about all the ways in which people could get information in that age, right? They could watch on TV, maybe, depending on the politics, what's happening. They could listen to the news. They could read any number of newspapers. They had all kinds of things on social media that would peg them into other things. They had cell phones. They could record what was happening. There's endless ways for you to know what's happening. And of course, that's the problem, is that we're bombarded with endless claims about what's happening. And not only that, with endless empty spaces where things that are happening aren't really being covered so much, right? The reason the speakership battle was covered so profoundly or at least so extensively, is because the spectacle of it, right? It was noteworthy. It did seem to suggest what, the next 2 years are going to be like, but more than anything else, it was a historic moment. You're watching a historic moment. Everybody, historic moment. Let's talk about other historic moments. Thank you, Joanne Freeman. That's what we were watching. But have we heard much? This morning I got up and I read, I guess, who was it? It was Hakeem Jeffries, I think, went on a social media platform and said, here are the 3 things that have happened in 3 days in the House, that legislation that was passed. I didn't hear anything about that legislation. I was like, oh, Kidoki. I didn't know why, because that's no longer in the center of interest of newspapers. They've gone on to talk about something else. Well, I was going to say a second thing too. Oh, the rules. We heard, or at least I heard, like murmuring that there were the rules for the House, and some of the rules were secret, and that not everyone knew them. That could be baloney, but I don't know. And I don't, maybe you folks, again, during the question period, you folks can chime in with what you are or are not seeing. But that's a pretty dramatic question that could profoundly shape how the House works. And at one point in one of the media things I did, I said, rules, what's coming up is rules, and rules can shape what's happening in Congress enormously. And I got quoted, I think, on like somewhere online, some Twitter. Freeman says the rules, you cannot exaggerate the degree to which the rules can shape a Congress. Like, well, there it is. The point has been made, and it will never be made again. So my point here is, on the one hand, which happens so often in American history, not to look back and think that there was some golden moment of impartiality when the press was ideal. There have been better times and worse times. There have been more blatantly biased times and less. There have been some forms of media that have tried harder to be unbiased, and others that really have no interest in doing that at all. It's not, as with everything else in history, there's no straight line. But my point is, and particularly with the speakership debate, I wanted us to be able to discuss, and in a sense, I might end a minute or two early, because what I'm interested in doing, among other things, is hearing what you saw and what that battle looked like to you. Because I will bet, I was watching C-SPAN. I'm sure not everybody was watching C-SPAN. So I doubt that. But depending on what people were watching, they got a different sense of what was going on there. Different things were included or not included. Now that we're back to normal with the C-SPAN cameras out, the cameras now that are there are the ones that are always there and that are largely controlled by the speaker and the party in power. So who knows what we'll see. But that night, those series of nights with the battle, the speakership battle, that it just was an interesting standout moment when the press could cover it as they chose, but there was just footage of what was happening. I really would love for the C-SPAN cameras to be there all the time. Not, as I said at the outset, not because I think we would see anything dramatic necessarily, right? But if they were there, we could actually see what is or isn't happening on the floor. And if that means one person is speaking and there are 3 other people in the room, don't you think we should know that? I think we should. I think we should be able to see what this body looks like when it works. And I think we should understand that so much of the business of Congress happens in committees and in other places. But I think it would be a fine thing if people were able to tune into not a closed, careful view, but a broader, less edited view of what was going on in Congress. In the 19th century, with the congressional record, you only got what people decided you should see. And the problem with my project lurking over my shoulder, my book, is that violence sometimes was shown because it made someone look good or scored a point. Sometimes it was really not shown because it made someone look bad. not in the record at all. I've talked before about how sometimes the record would say there was a sudden sensation in the corner. And I grew to learn that that meant something bad happened in the corner, but now I had to find it somewhere besides the newspapers because it was blocked out. People also, congressmen also regularly went to press offices and asked to read the press transcription version of their speech and changed it so that it felt more accurate to them. Excuse me. Anyway, my larger point here is that I can't speak, that we have never had totally unvarnished, a clear view of much, unless there are special circumstances in American history. And we need to think about when we are reading about something, when we are thinking about something, when we are watching something, when we are getting news about something, we always need to think about the fact that this is selective, this is partial, and we don't know how biased it is. We need to think about it. And I know we've talked a lot here about, being better or teaching students to be better about fact checking and seeing where information comes from and trying to tell good information from bad information and good sources from bad sources. And all of that is important. But even a step above that, I think we just, particularly in this day and age, have to stop and think about what we're seeing and what we're not seeing and what it means. Even before we get to the specifics of the misinformation, what are we seeing and what are we not seeing? And what are we not seeing? What does that suggest? What are we not getting in the picture? Why not? And how might it change if it's there? And it's tricky, I realize, to say, here's the thing I am not seeing, right? How do you argue about not seeing something that already isn't there? But you can do that, again, like I just did, right? Are we seeing a lot about the rules? Interestingly, since that's kind of a big deal. No. So anyway, think about, before you even get to thinking about accuracy, just think about the media itself, what it's covering, what it's not covering, what that means, and what you'd like to know more about. Because once you do that, once you get to that, you can go out and Google around responsible Googling, and see what you could find, right? If I had the time, I might sit down and look to see what I could find out about the whole rules thing. And if anybody has anything to say, there's a topic that we were talking about, my podcast team was talking about covering, and we were like, nope, not enough actual verified information. We're not going to talk about it. So anyway, it's a different spin on what I've said before, which is always think before you respond. Don't let your emotions lead you when you're getting information, because sometimes the point is to get you emotional. It's a different spin on that, which is what am I seeing and what am I not seeing? One last point, and then I'll stop. I didn't end 2 minutes early. Another way in which this is very true is using archives. And there are many historians who are writing about this, or certainly create a project, write a book with a great awareness of this. And that is, there are enormous holes in archives, right? Archives collected for a long time what they consider to be important, which were the papers of elite white men, which means if you want to study people besides elite white men, archives often have huge gaping holes, and you have to be really creative in finding other ways to get evidence and finding other ways to pull people out of different kinds of historical artifacts and manuscripts. But you could totally see how if you weren't thinking about that and you went into an archive and you looked around and you came out with an idea of this is what I saw, you'd be missing a big part of the picture. So think about what you're seeing, think about what you're not seeing, think about what you'd like to see, all in this age when, in a sense, we're seeing too much because there's so much of it. Okay, I'm going to, this is going to be a very logical mug. I'm now at the point where I'm like slightly disappointed if I don't see mug. So if there's anyone here who's new, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. If there's anyone here who's new, what is this, week 145? I think that's what I saw someone say. Correct. Woohoo. Okay, so we've been doing this for 145 weeks. And every week I've had a mug that relates to the theme that we're talking about, and I don't have 145 mugs. So we're definitely having like summer reruns here. But this one, how could I not use this mug?
Oh,
My C-SPAN mug, my
that's
C-SPAN, right, book TV mug. Because
mug.
truly, I know it's a nice big
love
mug.
it. I love it.
Because C-SPAN really deserves credit for sticking it out and staying there for the whole shebang. I was ridiculously fascinated by it because it's contingent, right? Because we didn't know what would happen. And that's important. That's vital as you're watching something to understand that. At any rate, okay, I'm going to stop talking so that we can talk. I partly, I'm very willing to answer questions, but I'm really particularly interested in understanding what you saw or didn't see of the speakership battle, and how that differs from person to person here. What did the press enable you to see, or what did you see the way that you normally confront the press? Because again, it's not only in history that you can see 3 different events by reading 3 different newspapers. That's always been the case. And I want to know what happened now. But anyway, okay, now I will stop.
Yeah, a lot of people have been throwing some of their personal reflections in the chat. So I know we'll save that and we'll archive that. They've also been sharing great resources, Joanne, for those of us that are teachers, sites that they use to help the kids sift through the fake news, right?
Oh,
so there've been lots of good sharing, websites that look at media bias and that sort of thing. So if you are an educator that joins us every week, either in person or you look at the video that John posts, lots of good resources this week in the chat. All right, we've got great questions.
Before we go to the questions, one last thing I forgot, and I said I was going to say it. If there's anyone who is here for the first time, which there may be, tell us, go into chat and tell us, because the History Matters community is a crazy good community, and you will be welcomed into the History Matters community. So, okay, now I can stop.
Absolutely. Okay, so this comes from our friend Dave, and he said, the reason Dr. Freeman got so many media requests is her terrific New York Times op-ed. And he asked, were you interviewed by any print media or other TV, radio, podcast? And were there any sentences or paragraphs that you spoke off the cuff that you wish you could go back and edit or reword like you would be able to do in your own written response?
Interesting. That's a really interesting question. I suppose it wasn't until after it was out that people started with Republicans have ideas, and I had to start saying ideas aren't policies. I might have been more explicit about that since that seemingly, but that's not something I think I blame myself for not thinking about, because it seems obvious to me that a policy and an idea are not the same thing. No, I don't know if I would have said something different. I mean, I will say that that was very fast. I did that in the middle, obviously, as this battle was still ongoing. The New York Times said they wanted to put it out right after it was decided. So once we had a speaker, they wanted to throw the piece out. And so they first said, Monday, looks like Monday, because they're not going to decide today and then we'll have the weekend. And then I get this frantic email, no, tonight, they're deciding tonight. So I managed to throw in one last sentence about that brawl, the lunge in the House at the last second. I said, you can't publish this without a sentence about them. So they threw that in. But I don't think there was something explicitly that I didn't think I should put in the piece. But the piece, was very targeted. And there were certainly other things that were interesting to talk about. I'm trying to see if I wrote it down here. Did I? And maybe I didn't. Darn it. There was one, actually, Connecticut Public Radio, the Colin McEnroe Show, which is a really wonderful radio show. And I've been on there before, and they're just thoughtful. And you don't get 3 minutes, you get actually like 15 or 20 minutes to talk. And they were the only place that said, are there questions you think are important that should be asked? They were the only place that did that. So anyway, I'm chattery because I'm really tired and not caffeinated, oddly enough. So, okay.
You need more coffee, Joanne.
I need any coffee. Oh, this is iced tea, and it's not punchy. Anyway, Okay.
We need to start delivering one of those cardboard totes of coffee to your doormat every Friday morning. John, is there money in the budget for that? Anyway, Kathleen has a great question. She asked, are there other times in history where we have seen the demonization of the free press as much as we have in recent years? And what do you think that means for our democracy?
Well, you're getting with the good questions. Certainly the press is demonized and has been for a long time. And certainly if you're the people in power, you're particularly angry at the press if it doesn't, it's picking on what you're doing, and you're going to be the ones being picked on because you're the ones doing things. So yes, on the one hand, people have been angry about the press. They've called the press biased and partisan. Thomas Jefferson griped about the press, like, I can't believe anything I read in the newspaper. So yeah, it goes all the way back that people are saying, newspapers are biased and you can't believe them. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that's the price of a free press, right? Is that people can say what they want in the press, and the responsibility more than anything else is on us as the reader. Not ideal. And thus the people who, Jefferson certainly is a believer in a free press, and he was really irritated by the newspapers and what they were doing. The second half of that question was what? Repeat it for me.
Have we seen in recent years this attack? And she asked, what does it mean for our democracy?
Right. Okay. So what strikes me as particularly targeted in recent years has been this enemy of the people trope, right? And it's not like this is the first time people have said that, but it's one thing to say the press is inaccurate, the press lies, the press is doing all kinds of things that are irresponsible, the press hates my party, the press hates all of these things that people said. But to declare that the press is the enemy of the people, I'm not going to say that's the first time that's ever been said in the United States, but to have that as a main theme and thread and stream of what you're saying about the press, that's noteworthy. Because that's not just saying the press has problems. That's saying a free press is the enemy, which is, if you're going to make a list of things that can hold people accountable, this is why a free press, in early America, people talked about it so much. How else do you hold people in government accountable unless you're covering them and putting out what they're doing in the press? That I remember I think I said this last week, maybe, some quote about the early Congress in the first couple of years of the 19th century, who said if there wasn't, if Congress was not being covered by newspapers, then it would be the most corrupt body on the face of the earth, because no one would be watching and no one would know what they're doing. So on the one hand, it's vitally important. It's about accountability. On the other hand, it can get in the way. I'm not going to even go off on that topic, because we could talk episode after episode about the press today. But enemy of the people is a particularly scary thing to base your view of the press on, and to repeat and to have it as something that people who follow you repeat and say. If you're an enemy, if the press is the enemy of the people, then accountability is out the window.
Okay, Ellen has given a kind of a long question. I'm going to try and compact it. So she's talking about how the press seems to have tunnel vision sometimes when there's a really big story like the COVID pandemic, or in my head, I'm thinking like Ukraine for a while. That's all that was on the news. But she says that during COVID, there was an incident where a particular pharmaceutical company raised children's asthma medicine from $30 to over $300. And a lot of parents in America were really freaking out. They couldn't afford to buy this medication. And she said she, as a parent with a child in that situation, contacted lots of news stations hoping they would bring this to light. And nobody ever did, because they were so obsessed with COVID, right? And she was wondering, does the media get caught up in one story and then as if nothing else is going on in the world, and why why you think we see that pattern sometimes.
Right. We see that all the time, right? Is that, and sometimes it's because it's spectacle, sometimes it's because it's seems like such a big deal that how could you not have it at the center of everything that you're doing? But yeah, I had a former student, a former undergrad who for a little while was working in journalism. And he came back after a while. I can't remember what he worked for in news for a TV station, I think. And he came back and he said, the thing I've really learned about being here is we feel like there's a crisis in crime because that's all the TV station focuses on. And that actually, when you think about what I'm there and I can see what they're choosing to cover and not to cover, and things don't look the same to me as they appear to look based on what's coming out of the press. So yeah, all the time, I think, there's one story that seizes everybody. And in this sense, you see the press not as the tool of accountability, but instead as the tool of capitalism, right? As something that's trying to make money and get eyeballs and get clicks and everything else that, any media outlet wants. Then yeah, they go along on the train and don't go off and look at the stories that are certainly, like this one, vitally important, but don't seem to be, at the center, the obvious story to cover. It was interesting in the middle, at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was in New York, and I didn't know what was going on, right? All I knew is that there were sirens constantly sirens. And everything was closing down, and we were, you had to like wash anything you bring in from outside. It was like this crazy time where no one knew what was going on. And I remember not knowing where to turn to know what was going on, right? So I'm like alone in my apartment with my small green bird. Actually, he wasn't here yet at that point. So I'm just alone in my apartment. And people are saying it's this deadly, horrible disease, and I can hear all the ambulances going by because New York got it really early. The only way I ultimately got any sense of what was going on was because the governor went on TV at 11 o'clock every day and described what New York was doing and what was happening. Now, I was, that was it for me. Like, I didn't know where else to get my information from since nobody else really was claiming to offer information that was very reliable. But, who knows what he offered or didn't offer us. But there's an example of, someone, a lot of us, I'm sure, grabbing at that. It was like, how else can I know, right? Here's someone sort of throwing this out. Again, it gets back to the same thing, which is we need news, we reach for news, and news decides what news does. And sometimes that's what we need, and sometimes it isn't what we need. This morning I was reading about access, right? That nowadays it seems like the press is so controlled by access to the right people. So they don't want to upset people and lose their access to these people, which again is not a new thing, but it appears right now to be a sort of, we're all in the same club together moment of the press and the politicians. These are all, I sort of feel like we could sit here and tick off a string of ways in which the press is problematic generally, and is in some ways, some media outlets in some ways are, I think, failing at their coverage of what's going on in their effort to be constantly, oddly enough, based on everything that I said, so unbiased, so balanced, that they're afraid of stepping forward and saying, this is a lie, this isn't true, depending on who made the lie. That, the both sidesism, which we've heard a lot about, you can understand why the press is trying to make no waves and make it, oh no, both sides, it's both sides. Sometimes it's not both sides. And we need investigative journalism to actually say, this is what appears to be happening, and this is where it's happening, and this is where it isn't. And at this particular moment, those kinds of failures, which are not new failures, but at this particular political moment where democracy is where it is, those failures can be pretty severe. And so it's another reason why I'm addressing what I'm addressing this morning. If you're talking about the survival of democracy, if you're talking about helping it to continue on and to get stronger, right, then a free press is at the center of that. And without an analytical free press that really is aiming to get information out rather than cover the things that it thinks people want to see and not get the wrong people angry, that's a huge difference. And I'm sure all of you see that too in, people say it all the time in newspapers, right? The press is failing us, the press is failing us. And I always feel bad about that because there are journalists out there doing a really good job. So I don't want to move into the enemy of the people zone by saying, the press could do a better job. But the press could do a better job than it's doing right now.
And I think Gloria I think you've sort of already answered Gloria's question. Gloria had added, how does political bias or favoritism distort what we see? But I think we sort of delved into that just now.
And it does, right? I mean, you pick, I watch certain things and don't watch other things. And I assume certain things are reliable and other things aren't. And to me, it's based on pretty clear, actual things that suggest to me that some things are really just blatantly not true. But it's true, you have to think of your own bias as well.
Yeah. All right, our friend Cece is asking, in the period, Joanne, that you mainly research, which is early America, what did the attempts at press regulation look like? A lot of outcry or very little, very much? And were the newspapers at all regulated?
Well, a lot of what happened, I wrote an article about this, and I don't even remember where I published it. That's how long ago it was.
Tim will find it and he will post the link in 30 seconds.
Of course, of course. I wrote a piece on, it was prompted by writing about the Sedition Act, but what it was really about was, it's like the culture of the Sedition Act or something like that. What I was interested in is what happens when people want to regulate the press. And what I saw a lot of, it's not the only way the press was regulated, but there were a lot of elite white men taking editors to court, right? Suing editors, because newspapers in this period, they're not huge enterprises. It's, an editor and maybe a reporter or two working with the editor, and then the people who are actually making the newspaper itself. So editors would get brought to court for libel. I think there's a book called Protecting the Best Men that talks about it in this time period that I remember reading when I wrote this article. So the press was regulated. You could sue people for libel. The Sedition Act all by itself, right? You can't say bad things about the government. Now, what's interesting about that is they said during a time of war, it'll weaken the way that the government looks. The people won't believe in it. But of course, the Federalists were also just trying to silence Republican newspapers. And they said it. That's what this article talks about roughly, is Federalists saying on the one hand, like, this is a time of war, we need the press to be behind us and not against us. And then on the other hand saying, crush the Republican newspapers. So they were doing both things at the same time. But at any rate, so the answer is yes, there's some regulation. Some of the regulation is physical, right? Sometimes editors, since again, they're the target of all of this, there are editors that just got beaten in the street. The editor of the New York Post, which was the Federalist Hamiltonian newspaper, William Coleman, he gets beaten so badly at one point that I think he's paralyzed from the waist down after that point. There are many reporters that get beaten down even in the press gallery in Congress in the early, first half of the 19th century. So that's another way the press is regulated, is just intimidating and beating reporters. And I write in my book about reporters showing up with weapons when they go to report on the House because someone said something threatening about them on the floor, and they feel that person, I think what one of the reporters says, he has an alarming physique. So he comes, one of them brings a big stick, a cane, and I can't remember what the other one brings, but at any rate, that's a way of regulating the press too.
It makes me think of when certain reporters were being banned from the White House press room a couple of years ago. And also, you know, the reporters that literally risked their lives, like Jamal Khashoggi, that to tell the truth. And
right.
You know, that's hard to explain to students when they see things like that. All right, we've got more questions. Dale,
I do want to say, yes, yes. Hang on. Yes, Tim, that is the article I was talking about.
I told you he'd find it.
I just needed to say that. Okay, so I'm sorry.
I don't think we've ever stumped Tim. That would be a good game show. How do you stump Tim? Okay, Dale had a couple of questions. The first is, what have been some of the better times in media coverage of Congress? Have there been any good times?
Well, sure, there have been good times and there have been good outlets. You know, one thing that struck me as interesting along these lines is it's not till, I'm not going to be able to pinpoint precisely, it's well into the 19th century, you know, let's say the 1840s, 1850s, when I began seeing reporters who were struck by the fact that they could interview politicians. They could ask them questions and then write what the answers are, because they were really just watching Congress and reporting on it, Washington reporters. And there were a handful of people that were like, you know what? We can interview them. We can ask them questions and then write about that in the newspaper. But when you looked at congressional coverage in this time period, you either saw some version of debate and what was going on the floor, or sort of man on the street, right? Reports that were letters to the editor, which is why journalists are sometimes called correspondents in part. It's because for a long time, it was just letters from someone reporting. But in addition to that, after a while, people realized they could ask politicians questions. And just like around the same time period, there's a moment in which, I hadn't thought about this before, biographers discover that they can talk to people who knew the person they're writing about. There's, I think it's James Parton writing a biography of Aaron Burr, and he discovers and says in the introduction to the biography, I talked to people who knew him, which seems like the most obvious thing to do, but it's not what was done. So is that a particularly standout moment? No, but it's a moment when there was a change for the better. Politicians were a little freaked out, right? Because then all of a sudden they're being asked questions and they don't necessarily want to answer the questions, and it's a big change. So there have been moments when it's unquestionable to me that things kind of move in a good direction. And then there are other moments when they don't. And there are some outlets, you know, it's why I'm not going to say pervasively, this period was great, because there have always been, you know, notably renowned biased publications. And again, you have to be, you know, buyer beware, reader beware. You have to know what it is you're reading.
Yeah. This is a new friend. I don't remember having a question from this person. So if you're new, let us know in the chat. It's Ann Blumenthal. I don't think I've seen Ann, or maybe I just have not. But anyway, her question is, she says she gets most of her news nowadays from a variety of Substack blogs. And so she's wondering to what extent are blogs now supplanting the mainstream media as some people's main or only news source. And she says these blogs seem to have a lot of bias towards truth. So she's just wondering if you want to comment on that more recent technology or form of communication.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I obviously Heather Cox Richardson's, you know, Substack is like a huge source of news for everyone. She tries very hard to stick with facts. She has footnotes for the facts that she talks about. You know, she's trying to be that kind of a source. The thing with any personal account is, no matter how objective the person is trying to be, and in her case, I think she's really, really trying hard, but it also is one person's account of what they see and what they believe to be important. Doesn't mean it's bad or untrue, but it doesn't, if people are reading Heather's letters from an American and nothing else, they're just not seeing the things that Heather decided not to write about. It's not good or bad, but you know, I think Substack is great because you can offer personal ideas and you can go on at length and you can get a lot of facts. It's also personal. It's attached to a person. So I think you need to think carefully. Like in the case of Heather, I think she's proven herself to be someone who's really focused on the facts. You have to think about what you're seeing in the Substack and who the person is, kind of like in the old days with an editor. Like, who is this editor anyway? Now you can say, well, who is this person that I'm following and what does it mean that I will see or won't see? There was something on maybe Twitter yesterday that I didn't pause to look at, but it was trying to look at who major media influencers look at to get their news. And thus, what do they tend to see and what do they not tend to see, which was really interesting. So I can't remember where I saw it. Heather was one of the people that they were like, you know, who does she tend to go to on Twitter? Who are the people she goes to most often? Surprise, Joanne Freeman. Hey. that's there are real reasons for that aren't about the news she sees. But at any rate, that's a really good question. It's another, yeah, well, Heather is like a rock star now. But at any rate, Substack I think is good and interesting. And I think people should read them. And then I think people should remember what they're reading.
Yeah. All right. Our good friend Tim asked, the House and Senate often conducts business far into the evening. Why is their work schedule this way? Does it impact how we view and understand and interact with Congress when they had these, you know, up until 11, 12 o'clock at night votes and things like that?
You know, those aren't necessarily the norm. So here's what I was thinking as it went, you know, I think 10 o'clock at night, the final session when they broke the contest and they picked a speaker, it began at 10 o'clock at night. And that's when this Arkansas, I think, Alabama congressman lunged at Matt Gaetz. And I don't think I tweeted it and I didn't put it in the article, but almost without fail, evening sessions bring violence. It's like, you know, they happen all the time, but in evening sessions, it's like the mood is different. People have had dinner, maybe they've had a drink with dinner. It's less formal. People kind of feel like they shouldn't be there and they are. It's like just the whole mood changes. And you could see that. I think I did say something like that somewhere. I've been like on every social media platform in the world trying to decide who reaches what where. But, you know, I think the evening, staying in the evening when things really have to get done is a long time tradition. And in the first half of the 19th century, it was a well-boozed tradition where they would just, committee rooms would become bars. Congressmen would be on the floor drinking out of teacups and drinking booze and calling it cold tea, right? So anyway, when this lunge happened, I was like, there you go, an evening session.
Maybe we need to have cold tea in our mugs when we do the live History Matters at the conference.
I do have cold tea in my mug. Ooh. It's cold tea.
He knows for sure. Okay, we have 3 questions. Do you think we can squeeze them in? They're very short.
Yes.
Okay, our friend Scott asked, is it possible the kerfluffle was designed as a distraction to avoid answering questions about January 6th?
Well, I've seen people say that. Perhaps it seems to me what felt most realistic to me was that there was this small group of people that wanted power and saw that they could get it at this moment. That to me seemed pretty straightforward. Could something else be true? Sure, it could. You know, I'm basing my assumption based on who these people are and how they've behaved and what they do and how they've treated some government institutions. That's that, you know, but again, sure, if I would totally be willing to believe if someone, you know, stepped forward and said, you know, so-and-so said to me, and I have it on a tape recorder, the only reason for that was to block out discussion of January 6th. It didn't work really well if that's the case, because man, I did a lot of talking about January 6th. Yeah. But it could be, you know, I mean, I have to say that too, is that I think what I think, and I base it, I hope, on facts, and I'm open to being proven wrong with facts, right? No one can claim to know everything all the time.
All right, we've got two short ones.
Okay.
Melissa Elliott asked, how does honor play into threats of political violence today?
Okay. How does honor play into threats of political violence? Well, I'll answer that in a short way, since I know we're already over. When I talk about honor in modern politics, people think I'm saying politicians today are honorable, and that's not the kind of honor I'm talking about. Today, I might say the better word to use would be reputation. What do people make of your reputation, right? To be a man of honor was to be a certain kind of man in the 18th and first half of the 19th century. Nowadays, I think, people are thinking about what their reputation is, reputation among their peers, reputation among their constituents, just general reputation. And I think that plays a big role, and again, I think it's part of why we don't have C-SPAN cameras on all the time showing everything that's going on, because some people don't want everyone to see everything that's going on. But I think reputation matters a lot. But I don't think that necessarily means that everyone is careful all the time, because if you think back to the health insurance, most recent, I guess, health insurance struggle, when there were Republican members of Congress who wouldn't have town hall meetings back home because they just didn't want to discuss it. Like that was pretty out in the open. That was, that certainly shaped their reputation. So anyway, that's the word I would use for now to judge this. And I would say it still has a huge role to play. It still affects whether you get power as a politician. It still affects whether your constituents will vote for you, what kind of power you have on Capitol Hill, all of these things. The person that'll be interesting to judge this from is George Santos. He's got quite a reputation. I don't know what that's going to mean with what he does or doesn't do in the House.
Yeah, he's digging in. All right, the last one just asks, how do we deal with facts when politicians deny they said or did something and it's clearly on video for everyone in the world to see? That's from Dale.
That's beyond frustrating. If you're commenting on the news in some place, it's very effective to say, well, actually on January 6th, he did say it, and here it is on video, right? That's sometimes, if you can just step forward with, the quote, the fact, you don't have to say anything else, right? That's just, there it is. And granted, nowadays we have people saying, no, fake news, they made it up, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, there will be people that will say, oh, there it is. I can see it. This is true for historians as well. I always say to my students, if someone asks you a question and you feel that they're not quite believing the answer, if you can think through your source material and find people from the time period who agree with what you're saying and say, well, this isn't just me, because these 5 people at the time also thought this, that's a different kind of evidence, right? That's the equivalent of, I have this on a tape recording. It's, there are 5 letters in which this person said, I did this. So we don't think he did it because we don't know. And yet he said it 5 times. So what does that mean? So it partly, stepping forward with actual evidence, despite the fact that we know it'll be contested, becomes really important in this kind of a venue.
Yeah. And I'm thinking like all the people that were videotaping on their phones during January 6th and the January 6th hearing, they used that footage, I think, pretty effectively to make their point. Okay.
Yeah.
We cleared the deck. Yay.
Excellent. We're only a few minutes beyond. Now let me explain what's going to happen next for those of you who may be new and for those of you who are trying to get bingo. So what we're going to do now is move to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording this conversation, and we can continue our conversation and talk about whatever we want in a less formal way. Not that we were formal before, but it'll free things up and we can talk about whatever we want to talk about. If you are beaming in from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through the particular URL from NCHE to get here. You need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. So leave Facebook, go to that URL, and poof, you will be in the after party with us. If you are already here, you know that the poof will happen and we will be in the after party. Wow, you guys are talking about scotch, which is really not fair. I really like Scotch. At any rate,
drinking talk going on in the chat today.
There's a lot going on. At any rate, I do want to black out bingo. Like, I'm so predictable. If there's anyone new here who doesn't know this, that everyone plays bingo based on what I say, and I'm so predictable. I could name the words now that I say. But at any rate, I want to thank you all as ever for coming, for being here for this, for engaging in the conversation of democracy, particularly now in these years that we are in. It is important. And I want to just thank you all for being here, because for any number of different reasons, it matters a lot. So the History Matters community, like, they're the best community. They're a rock of democracy. So thank you for being here, for asking questions, for engaging with each other, for keeping this a civil space. All of that's good too. Okay. So I guess,
John,
yeah, you have, and I'm not going to say it, Dave.
Okay, we're waiting for the recording to stop and the Facebook to go away.